Chapter 14. Nothing had really changed in all Japan, at least not in the way the promotion was run. In New Japan, when it was television night, you were always under pressure. The referee Peter Takahashi would be onto you all the time, saying, "You must do this, you must do that, you have to go so long," always a lot of pressure. With All Japan, there was no pressure. They more or less left us to get on with it. Some of the younger wrestlers, who were just starting out the last time I was there, had made a lot of progress. Jumbo Tsuruta and Tenryu were still the main event men, most of the time, but other wrestlers like Toshiaki Kawada, Mitsuhara Misawa, who was still wearing the tiger mask, had worked themselves into stronger positions on the card. Standards of wrestling were definitely higher in Japan, for the simple reason that good wrestlers were in the majority. We were just getting back into our stride, when a week into that first tour Emperor Hirohito died and all the wrestling cards were cancelled for the next 2 days as a mark of respect. We still got paid though, and as you can imagine, we didn't let those 2 days go to waste. There were a lot of familiar faces on the tour. American wrestlers were always a strong feature of the promotion, and it was good to see some of my old friends like Danny Spivey, Stan Hansen, Abdullah the Butcher, and Terry Bam Bam Gordy. The only ones who were missing were the Funk brothers, Terry and Dory Jr. We'd had some great times with them on our first run with All Japan. I remember one night when we'd been out drinking in Tokyo, myself, Terry Funk and Harley Race, and when it got late, we went back to my hotel room and started on the minibar. All of a sudden, for no apparent reason, Terry started smashing my room up. He broke the bed, and the lampshades, he more or less wrecked everything. I said, "I'm not being funny, Terry, but what are you doing?" He stopped, looked around at the mess, and said, "Don't worry, Dino. We'll go down to the front desk and report this." And we did. Terry walked straight up to the receptionist and reported the damage. Then he said to her, "And I know who's done it. I saw the guy breaking the place up." The receptionist called the police, and when they arrived, they asked Terry where this man, who had allegedly caused all the damage, was. Terry said, "He's in room 509. So the police went up to room 509 and knocked on the door. It opened, and it was Dory, Terry's own brother. He was half asleep and had absolutely no idea what was going on. Those two were as different as chalk and cheese. Dory was always very serious and straightforward, Terry was like a wild man, but as brothers, they were close. Terry used to talk a lot about the old days, when he and Dory Jr. took over their dad's promotion in Amarillo, Texas after he died. Business was down, and Terry was trying to think up new ways to bring more people in. He got on the microphone and said, "Ladies and gentlemen, next week we have a surprise for you. I am going to wrestle Terrible Ted the Grizzly Bear." As you can imagine, the people were quite excited by the idea, but when the State Athletic Commission found out, they objected. They told Terry there was no way he could wrestle a grizzly bear in that building. Well, Terry thought about this, and the following week, he went to collect Terrible Ted, just as he had planned, and picked him up in his brother Dory's brand new Cadillac. On the way back, he bought a can of white paint, and painted Terrible Ted from head to foot. He got white paint all over Dory's new car, and then drove to the arena. Terry got on the microphone and said, "Ladies and gentlemen, I'm afraid Terrible Ted couldn't make it. But don't worry. I've managed to get a replacement. It's Snowy the polar bear." Well, all those years later, Terry hadn't changed at all. He was still a little bit crazy. Just like the traffic in Tokyo at night time. We were all standing outside the hotel one night, the Bulldogs, Terry Gordy, Terry Funk and a few others. We'd all had a few beers. All of a sudden Terry Funk shouted, "Watch this." And he threw himself onto the bonnet of a passing car. As it stopped, he rolled off and pretended he was dead, with his arms stretched out wide. Somebody called the police, but even when they arrived, he just lay there, complete havoc all around him, not moving. There was nothing wrong with him, but for a few minutes he had everybody convinced that he was dead. But the funniest thing I remember about Terry Funk was the day I walked into his hotel room to check if he was awake. The coach was waiting to leave for the next destination, all the other wrestlers were on board, but Terry hadn't shown his face. I went back up to his hotel room, saw that the door wasn't locked, and pushed it open. There was Terry, lying on the floor, fully clothed and covered in sick. His Stetson was all crushed, he had one boot on, and one bare foot propped up on the bed. I leaned over him and said, "Terry, what happened?" The former NWA champion looked up at me, his eyes were all bloodshot and he could hardly open them, and he said, "Dino, there's only one way to become a champion." I said, "What's that, Terry?" He said, "You've got to be a total fuck up." It's been quite a few years since I last spoke to Terry, and that was one Christmas. I was in Calgary and I called his house in Texas. When he answered I said, "Hello Terry. It's only Dynamite calling to wish you a happy Christmas." Terry said, "Oh Dino, you've just ruined my fucking Christmas." So yeah, I did like Terry Funk, in and out of the ring, and for me, All Japan wasn't the same without him. But there were a lot of new faces. One American tag team who we met for the first time in Tokyo were the Nasty Boys, Brian Knobbs, and Jerry Saggs. To be honest, the first time I saw them, I didn't think much of them. They were both big men, and Knobbs was always joking and laughing and dancing around, in that loud, obnoxious way that some people do. But they were new faces in Japan, in fact it was probably their first tour, so me and Davey were giving each other looks, as if to say, who the fuck do they think they are? A few days later, we arrived at the arena, looked on the board, because you never knew who you were wrestling until you got there on the night, and saw it was the British Bulldogs against the Nasty Boys. We went to the ring. They were already in there with their Mohican haircuts, looking mean and vicious, as if they meant business. Just before the bell rang, I shook everything out, arms and legs, cracked my neck from side to side, like Mike Tyson used to do, and as I brushed my hand across my mouth, I muttered to Davey, "Don't sell anything." In other words, when they hit, don't respond, just crack them back. The match got underway, and right from the bell, whatever moves they tried, we countered them. We didn't give them a thing. Basically we made them look like a pair of idiots. Don't get me wrong, to the crowd it looked like a great match, at least from the Bulldogs' point of view. Towards the end of the match, Davey made the tag and I got in with Knobbs. I gave him a turnbuckle, and said, "Clothesline. Don't move." I threw him in, and he stayed there. Then I ran at him as fast as I could, and hit him with the clothesline, only I accidentally caught him across his face and split his mouth open. A couple of minutes later, I pinned him, 1, 2, 3. But even after I'd done that to Knobbs, they both came to see us after the match, shook our hands and said thank you very much. About 5 minutes after we'd got back to the dressing room, the referee, Joe Higuchi, walked in with a worried look on his face. He said, "Tom, Baba is very mad." I said, "Why, what's wrong with Baba?" "He is mad. You wrestled Nasty Boys, but Nasty Boys didn't do anything to Bulldogs." I decided to act dumb. "I'm sorry, I'm not with you, Joe." He said, "You wrestled them, but they don't wrestle back." I said, "Well, they could have done if they'd tried. But they didn't try. We did our best, Joe." Well, we weren't to know that Baba had big plans for the Nasty Boys, but yes, we did kick the shit out them that night, in a working fashion. Funnily enough, we also ended up becoming good friends, hitting the sushi bars, drinking beers and playing cards on the coach. We only ever had that one match with them, probably because Baba didn't trust us to wrestle them again. But if we had, I'd have been up in the air for them all night. That's true. That 4-week tour finished at the end of January, and we flew back to Vancouver and then on to Calgary. Davey had been quieter than usual for more or less all that tour. I mean, he still had a laugh and a joke, but I had an idea something was bothering him. I didn't give it a lot of thought, because once we were back home, I had Bruce Hart to deal with. Me and Bruce had our own opinions when it came to wrestling and how to promote it, and they were very different opinions. Because of that, there was always a little bit of tension between us, even going back to 1978 when we first met. Don't get me wrong, I never forgot that it was Bruce that brought me over to Canada in the first place, and I was grateful to him for that, but there was always that bit of friction between us, and just after I got back from Tokyo, it came to a head. We had to go to Yellowknife, one of the towns on the Stampede Loop. The wrestlers were still traveling around in a beaten-up old van, with holes in the floor. It was very cramped, and with 12 of us inside, with our cases on our knees, a 700-mile trip was the shits, which was what we had ahead of us this particular day. We all got in the van apart from Bruce, who told us he was getting a lift with a friend and would catch up with us later. So there we were, like sardines in a tin, driving along the highway, when all of a sudden this very nice Buick overtook us. I looked, and then I looked again. There was Bruce Hart, reclining in the passenger seat, feet up on the dashboard, hands behind his head, in other words, he was posing. He saw us all looking out of the van window, and he smiled and waved to us. I thought to myself, right. When we got to Yellowknife I found Bruce in the dressing room. I said, "How was your trip?" Bruce said, "Not too bad. A bit long." Then he started grinning like a Cheshire cat. He said, in a sarcastic tone, "Why, how was yours?" "Mine was all right, Bruce, but I'll tell you what you can do for me." He said, "What's that?" "You can get on the phone and get me an airplane, or a helicopter, and have me flown back to Calgary." He said, "I can't do that, Tom, but I'll tell you what, you can come back in the car with me." Bruce was still smirking, as if he didn't really mean it. And I must admit, I'd had a few beers in the van on the way, just like everybody else, so I said, "And you can fuck off. I came here like this, I'll go back like this." He just sniggered, and in that split second, I lost my temper, and, bang, cracked him one straight in the jaw, and walked out of the dressing room. I was still mad when I went to the ring with Davey. And when I got there, I realized that the ring announcer was the same person who had been driving the Buick. So during the match, I smacked him one as well. We were the last match on the card, so the fact that he couldn't do any more announcing that night didn't make a lot of difference. Somebody called the police, and straight after the match, Bruce and his friend made a dash for the Stampede van and locked themselves in while they waited for them to arrive. I went out after them. I was knocking on the window, shouting at Bruce to wind it down, but he wouldn't. To be honest, he looked scared to death. In the middle of all this the police arrived and they physically held me back while those two got out of the van, into their car and drove away. A week or so after that incident, it was Owen Hart's wedding. He was getting married to Martha, and me and Michelle were on the guest list. But the day before the wedding, I had a call from Ross Hart. He said, "Tom, what time will you be leaving for Edmonton tomorrow?" I said, "What do you mean, Ross?" He told me, "Look, Tom, if you turn up at the wedding, Bruce won't come. And if he doesn't come, Owen will be upset and Martha will be upset." I got the picture. I said, "I leave at 5. And the next day, which was Saturday, I did leave at 5. Do you think I went to Edmonton to wrestle? Course I didn't. I went to the pub instead. When Stu called to ask what had happened, I made some excuse about my car breaking down, and he didn't say any more about it. The following Friday was television night, and it was Bruce who came up to me and held his hand out. He said, "No hard feelings. We're still friends." So we shook hands, and that was the end of it. I don't know whether he really meant it, but we both knew we had to work with each other, and at least on the surface, he was okay with me. So were the rest of the family, apart from Dean. For some reason, Dean wouldn't let the matter drop. He wasn't that really involved in the wrestling business anyway, but he barged into my dressing room one night, being a bit cocky, and saying things which could have stirred up another load of trouble, which I didn't particularly want. The truth was, Dean Hart was very ill at that time with kidney disease. But it didn't stop him mouthing off and threatening me, so I started shouting back. Ross walked in right in the middle of all this, stood between us, and said, "Tom, don't. You'll kill him." I would never have touched Dean anyway, but it didn't make any difference. A month later, Dean Hart was dead. The kidney disease had killed him. The British Bulldogs were booked on another tour of All Japan that summer, but the reality was, as a tag team, the Bulldogs were just about through. We'd more or less finished wrestling in tag for Stampede, and Davey spent most of his time in singles matches. But Baba wanted us on that tour as a tag team, and I suppose Davey wasn't ready to give that sort of money up. Not then anyway. I'll be honest, this time around with All Japan we weren't as strong, name-wise, as we had been back in 1985. For one thing, I'd really started to cut down on the steroids. I still took the odd shot, but nothing like the amount I'd been taking over the years. And even though I was still working out hard every day, I lost quite a bit of weight. If that bothered Baba, he never said anything about it. I think he just wanted me there. I definitely felt better in myself for not taking it, but in the ring, knowing how my body used to look, seeing how some of the Japanese wrestlers' bodies still looked, I didn't feel too good about myself. So we couldn't get to the top of the card where we had been. I can remember the very first time we wrestled Jumbo Tsuruta and Genichiro Tenryu in the Yokohama Arena in 1985, when they were the two top men. I mean, in the annual tag team tournament, the final match would nearly always be Stan Hansen and Bruiser Brody against Tsuruta and Tenryu. And when we wrestled them, just on that one occasion, we went to a 30-minute draw, which, for us, was fantastic. And they were good to wrestle. I know with a lot of other tag teams they could be a bit awkward and single-minded, they liked to do everything their way. I wrestled Tenryu in a singles match in Osaka one night. At that time, I liked to get my opponent in the corner and finish very fast with a sharp elbow, right in the face. I'm not talking about close to their face, I mean in it. I knew Tenryu liked his matches to be sell, but I thought to myself, tonight, there's going to be a contest first. And that's what it was. I nailed Tenryu with 10 of my sharpest elbows. His chin was opened up, and when I looked, there was a river of blood pouring down over his neck and chest. All the people were going, "Ooh." The match finished and, fair enough, I did get beat. But when I saw Tenryu afterward, he was over the moon with that match. He smiled and said, "Kid-san. Very sharp elbow tonight." We also wrestled the Malenko brothers, Joe and Dean, at the Karakan Hall, and to be honest, when I first saw the bill, I thought it was going to look terrible. We were babyfaces, they were babyfaces, plus, the Malenkos favored a shooting style of wrestling. I thought, what are we going to do here? I went to see Joe, who was the eldest of the two brothers, and asked him what he wanted to do, style-wise. He said, "Well, what do you think?" I said, "I don't really care. We can shoot on the floor if you want, or what do you think about maybe mixing it with a bit of professional wrestling?" They were both happy to do that, and it turned out to be a great match. The submissions looked great, and we kept the pace of the match up with some strong professional wrestling. The crowd loved it. I got along fine with Joe and Dean, and as wrestlers, I rated the both of them. Carl Gotch had trained them, and as usual, boasted to everybody about what a good job he'd done, so good, he reckoned Joe was unbeatable on the floor. And Joe was such a gentleman, very polite and soft-spoken, but he did know the job. Dean and Joe were both quiet, and definitely not jokers. They took their work very seriously. We'd just finished a match at Budokan Hall in Tokyo one night when there was a knock at the dressing room door. I must admit, when I opened it, the last person I expected to see was Vince McMahon. I had no idea what he was doing in Tokyo, probably a little bit of business with another promoter, but he seemed genuinely pleased to see us. He walked in with a big smile on his face, looked at the pair of us and said, "Bulldogs, you're looking good." But apart from that, Vince McMahon wasn't at the Budokan Hall on a social visit. He said to me, "I'm surprised I haven't heard from you, Tom," meaning, how come we hadn't been in touch asking him for our jobs back. I said, "Vince, when I said I was finished, I meant it." But I don't think he believed me, because not long after that, he called me again, at home, and asked when I was coming back. I said, "I've already told you, Vince, I'm not coming back." He said, "Look, I want you to do a television in Maple Leaf Gardens with the Brainbusters. They could pile drive you on the stage, we'll air it coast to coast, then in 6 weeks' time, you come back for the return matches." I said, "So the Brainbusters pile drive me on national television?" "That's right." I said, "Thanks for asking me, Vince, but no thanks." I didn't hear from him again. Apart from the fact that I wouldn't go back to the WWF on principle, I knew that the British Bulldogs were just about through as a team anyway. It wasn't my decision, Davey Boy Smith had already decided that without telling me. On one flight home from Japan we were playing cards, 100 yen, maybe £4, a game, which I always won, because I knew how to fix the cards. Things hadn't been going too well between us for a while, we weren't speaking to each other properly, and there was a bad atmosphere. During that flight from Tokyo to Vancouver, I said to him, "Dave, why don't we get our act together and do something good as the Bulldogs?" He never answered me, he just shrugged. A few days after we'd got back, a mutual friend called round at my home, which was only a mile or so from Davy's house. He'd just been to see Davy, and I said to him, "How come he never comes here to see me?" He said, "Well, funnily enough, Tom, Davy thinks it should be you that goes to see him." Which was what I did most of the time anyway. But that, for me, was the moment when I realized it was over for the British Bulldogs. There was no argument, no trouble, no big dramatic split, the two of us just went our separate ways. While I'd been away, Stu had hired a couple of new wrestlers, one of which was a guy called Mitch Snow. Now that was a name I really didn't expect to hear again, not after what had happened in Japan a few years earlier. Mitch Snow was a big-mouthed prick. He loved to tell you he was from the Carolinas, but he said it in a way that implied if you were from anywhere else, you were a piece of shit. So I took a dislike to him more or less straight away. I think everybody on that tour did. Sometimes we would wrestle 6-man tags, where, for example, me and Davey might team up with Misawa. On this night it was Snow and 2 Japanese wrestlers against Don Morocco, and 2 other Japanese wrestlers. Towards the end of the match, Snow dived across Morocco for a crossbody block. When he got up from it, he looked at Don and shook his head, as if to say, "You nearly dropped me, you fucking idiot." Morocco caught the look and said to him, under his breath, "You piece of crap." Mitch Snow got on everybody's nerves. If the Bulldogs played a bit of a prank on somebody, we would all have a laugh about it, except for Snow, who would say, "Ha, you bulldogs could never catch me out. Anyway, this night he stood behind us watching the card game, and he kept chiming in saying, "You played that card wrong, didn't ya?" Everybody more or less ignored him, but me and Davey looked up at each other and nodded. 3 days before the end of that tour, we were wrestling a 6-man tag, the Bulldogs and Don Morocco against Snow and 2 Japanese wrestlers, one of which was Shinji Takano, the brother of George the Cobra Takano. I said to Shinji, "I'm going to do him tonight." He said, "How?" "When Morocco goes for the piledriver, we, my tag team partner and me, will spike him." He looked at me in surprise and said, "Kid-san, are you sure?" I nodded. Sure enough, Morocco went for the big piledriver, and when the time was right, I got on one rope, Davey got on the other, we jumped, grabbed one leg each and spiked him, straight into the mat. After the match, when Snow had cleared his head, Joe Higuchi took him to one side and said, "Tomorrow, you go home, for your own safety and welfare." But he didn't get away that easily. Later that night, Dan Crawford took him out to Roppongi, which is the red light district of Tokyo, for a few beers. While he was gone, we found some scissors and got into his hotel room. And I would say that Mitch Snow definitely lived to regret saying those words, "You bulldogs will never get me." So I was surprised when he turned up in Stampede Wrestling, although probably not as surprised as Mitch Snow when he found out I was the foreman. Part of my job was to sort out any trouble and keep the other wrestlers in line. We were in Lethbridge one night when some of the other wrestlers, just for a joke, decided to tie one of the lads up in a blanket from the hotel bed, fasten him to the back of the van and drag him along the road. It was icy, so the road was slippery, and they weren't driving very fast, but I'm sure, from where he was lying, Mitch Snow from the Carolinas didn't see the funny side of it. I was the foreman. I was supposed to be in charge. Well, you can imagine all the jokes and pranks I'd played on people over the years. So when I found out about this one, I thought, "Tommy, what are you going to do here?" I mean, if the shoe had been on the other foot, I probably would have driven the van myself. But I decided to be responsible, and I said, "Whoever's done this, if I find out, they will be fired." Well, it was Brian Pillman, wasn't it, and by rights I should have fired him on the spot, but to tell you the truth, by this point I'd had enough of being in charge. Deep down, I think I'd had enough of Stampede Wrestling. As for Mitch Snow, he must have thought he would never see the back of the Dynamite Kid, because a year or so later, I got a call from a promoter in Portland, Len Denton, who asked me if I was interested in some work. I told him I was. "That's great," he said, "but there is one condition." "What's that?" He said, "We've a wrestler here by the name of Mitch Snow. If you come down, he wants your assurance that you'll leave him alone." I'll tell you what, Len. Let's forget it. Johnny Smith, who, if you remember, was Ted Betley's nephew, John Hindley, was still with Stampede. He'd also worked a couple of tours for New Japan, and was doing okay for himself. Johnny had turned heel in Stampede and was wrestling as Johnny Smith, the British Bruiser. I always preferred wrestling as a heel anyway, plus I would sooner wrestle in tag matches, so we got together and became the British Bruisers. Johnny was a lot quieter than Davey, and was definitely not a prankster. He would never dream of doing half the things that I'd done. But he laughed as much as anybody at the things I did to other wrestlers. Like the time I nearly caused a fight between Bobby Fulton and Tommy Stanton. Bobby had a habit of brushing his hair and looking at himself in the mirror, while Tommy was always cleaning his glasses. They were very good friends outside the ring, but on this night they were wrestling each other. While they were gone, I put Bobby's brush down the toilet in one dressing room and Tommy's glasses down the toilet in the other. When they came back from their match, I went straight up to Tom and said, "I'm not being funny, Tom, you know I like a good laugh and a joke." He laughed and said, "Oh, I know that, Tom. I said, but I'm not being blamed for this one. I just saw Bobby put your glasses down the toilet. I told Bobby the same thing, that I'd seen Tom throw his brush down the toilet, just for a laugh. I said to him, it's out of order this Bobby. It's not right. Bear in mind, I was supposed to be the foreman at that time, so I said to Bobby, and I don't want my name mentioned in this. I'm not being blamed for something I haven't done. The next thing was, the two of them were going at it like crazy, but my name didn't get mentioned. One wrestler really did try to blame me for something I hadn't done. But he didn't get away with it. Sandy Scott, whose real name was Jim Palmer, came to Calgary from Scotland. In fact, it was me that brought him over to Stampede. He rang Stu up one day and said to him, Stu, I can't wrestle, I've got diarrhea really bad, and I know for certain that Dynamite's done me. When I got back to Calgary from wrestling round the loop, Stu called and said, what have you done to Sandy? He's had the shits all week and couldn't wrestle. I said, look Stu, even if it was me that had done him, I wouldn't tell you anyway. But you'll have to believe me that this time it really wasn't me. Which was absolutely true. I'll tell you where he's been. At home all week with a woman. Sandy Scott did have a reputation with the ladies. The next time I saw Sandy was on the Saturday when we were getting ready to go to Edmonton. I went to the back of the van where the cases were, looked for Sandy's, picked it up and threw it right up into a tree. It stuck there. The wrestlers climbed into the van, I sat down opposite Sandy and said to him, what's this you've been telling everybody that I'm supposed to have done you? He didn't say a word, just looked at me in an arrogant fashion and then looked away. So I clocked him in the face, not hard, but enough to annoy him. He jumped up and said, right, that's it. I'm not having this. And he got out of the van and went to get his case. I just sat there, acting very casual. A minute later he was back. He climbed back in the van, came up to me and said, where's my fucking case? I said, don't look at me like that when there are 12 other people in this van. He ignored me. What have you done with it? I said, trying not to laugh, no. Sorry Sandy. You're barking up the wrong tree altogether. But the truth was, I had become disillusioned with Stampede Wrestling. I'm sure I wasn't the only one. Chris Benoit was really shaping up and I knew that with his style he would go down well in Japan. He was ready for it. There was a little Japanese guy in Calgary who we used to call Tokyo Joe, and quite a few years ago he'd been involved in a bad road accident. It was winter and the van with all the wrestlers inside had broken down. Everybody climbed out and started trying to push the van from behind. A truck came along, skidded, and ran into the back of the Stampede van. Everybody except Tokyo Joe managed to jump clear, but he took the full brunt of it. In fact he almost lost both his legs, but they lay him down and packed a load of snow around them, and in the end he only lost one, which he had replaced with a wooden leg. I had a few arguments with Joe about other wrestlers, in particular, about Chris Benoit. Over the years, Joe had sent a lot of wrestlers over to Japan, to IWE and New Japan, but he always kept 10% of their guarantee. At one point I was trying to get Chris Benoit a deal with All Japan, but not with the intention of making any money out of it for myself. I believed Chris had the style and the ability to go places in Japan. In fact, if it wasn't for the difference in age, I would definitely have had Chris Benoit as a tag partner. That's how high I rated him. Anyway, when Joe heard that I was trying to help Chris get some work in Japan, he accused me of stealing his boys from him. I said to him, well, why do you always take their money? Joe said, if you had any sense, you'd do the same. I said, and if I had some gas, I'd throw it over that wooden leg of yours and set the bloody thing on fire. There had been a few problems with Stampede and things came to a head when Stu paid me a couple of bad checks. They were way short of what they should have been, so after the matches, I went to see him, told him I was finishing, and handed the checks back. I said, evidently, you need these more than me. Stu didn't say anything, but he took them off me. And at that moment, I believed I was finished with Stampede Wrestling. I thought about the Brainbusters, Anderson, and Blanchard, going into the WWF from what was then Jim Crockett Promotions, and figured it might be worth trying to return the favor. So I called Ric Flair, who was now head booker for the promotion. He said, "Hello Dynamite. What can I do for you?" When I told him I was looking for some work, the lying bastard said, "Oh, we don't do that kind of thing anymore." I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "We don't have wrestlers switching promotions anymore. So I'm sorry. I really can't help you." I didn't believe him for a minute. What he really meant was, he knew I had a reputation and he didn't want me upsetting anybody in his promotion. As the year came to a close, Stampede Wrestling went down for the count. Business was so bad that Stu had no choice but to wind the promotion up. But he wanted to go out on a high note, which I could understand. I'd just got back from a tag team tournament in Japan, when he called me at home and said, "Kid, we're closing down and I need you to do me a favor. Will you do a street fight with Owen for the last night of Stampede?" I didn't want to let him down, so I said I would. The street fight was the main event for a sold-out crowd in the pavilion, on the very last night of Stampede Wrestling. I'd helped to train Owen when he was a kid, but I'd never wrestled him before. Because it was the last night, I knew Stu would want Owen to win, partly because in Stampede, the Hearts always did, and partly, I think, because of what I'd done to Bruce. Anyway, Owen did win, not by pinfall, as Stu expected, but by countout. Which didn't matter anyway, because it was a great match. Better than anyone imagined. A couple of days later, Stu called again. He said, "We did great business on that last night, do you think you could do another one, a street fight?" So, again, I said, "No problem." But before Stu could say anything about the finish I knew what he wanted. I said, "But I'll do it my way." The crowd was whipped up into a frenzy that night. After the first street fight, they were expecting something good, and I wasn't going to disappoint them. I didn't even wait for Owen to get to the ring. As he walked down the aisle, with all the fans cheering him, I ran up behind him and smashed him over the head with a trash can. Bear in mind, Owen was a lot younger than me, but we still had a good, hard match, physically tough and very violent. We both bled all over the place. Owen backdropped me out of the ring, but the referee didn't see it. I lay there on the concrete, and then Owen came out and hit me with a piledriver, right onto the concrete, which split my head open. Somehow, I managed to get back in the ring, and we really went at it, blasting away at each other. Johnny Smith was at ringside, and as I caught Owen and held him from behind, I signaled to Johnny to get in the ring and help me out. He ran in, and threw a punch at Owen's face with a knuckle duster, but somehow, Owen dropped to his knees, and Johnny caught me, bang, straight in the mush instead. Owen stood up, drop-kicked Johnny over the top rope and small packaged me for the pin. 1, 2, 3. The Hearts had their final moment of glory, the crowd got a fantastic match, and Owen, bless him, proved what a good wrestler he had turned out to be. But in 1989, that was it for Stampede Wrestling. In all the years I was with the promotion, I worked really hard for Stu, and I know for a fact that I helped to turn business around when the promotion was struggling back in the early 80s. What do you suppose I got at the end of it? Not a thank you, not a kiss my ass, nothing. But that's wrestling.